I'm so excited I can hardly stand it. I don't even know where to begin. But I guess we can start like this. You know, some memories just stay with you, right? 6 months ago, I got married, and I'll never forget that as long as I live. It was a magnificent evening, and the honeymoon was just as good. Another memory. 30 years ago. I've been doing this 30 years. 30 years ago. And if I've been doing it for 30 years, that's about 1,500 sermons. Ballpark. That's a lot. And most of them I don't remember any more than you do. Listen to them. But there's one in particular that stands out in my mind's eye just as if it had happened yesterday. It's 30 years ago at the First Baptist Church of Omaha. Would have been spring of 1992. And I can still smell the fresh cut grass. Kid's mother and I walked around to the front of the church to see the marquee. Remember the old church signs that changed from week to week, and it said, Aaron Seifert, the prodigal son. More than a little bit prophetic. It was the first sermon that I ever delivered in my home church. Not the first sermon I ever gave. That distinction goes to the Open Door Mission in Omaha, Nebraska. I had preached there. I had preached in the Lancaster County Jail. And I had preached in a Sunday evening service of the church that I attended while in college. But never had I been anywhere near the pulpit of the First Baptist Church of Omaha. First Baptist in Omaha was a don't rock the boat kind of church. It was old, it was established, it was extremely traditional. My parents were members, my grandparents were members, my great-grandparents were members. And here I was on a Sunday morning delivering my very first sermon from that esteemed pulpit. Afterwards, Walter Nothnagel told me I was destined to become the next Billy Graham. Wanda Chandler and Marvine Lutz said they hadn't heard preaching like that in 50 years. But in the back corner was a crew. It sat like this, with their arms crossed. And at lunch that afternoon, I'm sure said, who does this 21-year-old upstart think that he is? He's got a semester of Bible college under his belt, and here he is bringing us the gospel. Well, I'm not trying to hear it. Something I learned that day that has stuck with me for the entire trajectory of my ministry career is that the opinion of the home crew is incredibly important to the formation of the preacher. And I'd like to believe that the same is true in the life and ministry of Jesus. We see his first sermon this morning at the First Baptist Church of Nazareth, where he was a member. That's a joke. There were no Baptists. But we see Jesus coming to terms with what it meant to be among your own people, but also what it meant to be a preacher, a proclaimer of God's good news. In Luke chapter 4, verse 14, our narrative begins with a summary statement. Luke's gospel contains many of them. Just kind of, this is where we're at in the development of the story. This is what's happening. It says, then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee. And a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. This is what's happening in the genesis of Jesus' ministry. This is how it starts for him. And I like to think that in these early narratives in the life and story of Jesus, we get a remarkable insight into his humanity, who he was as a person among people, in addition to being the Son of God. So here's Jesus with a successful pulpit ministry. And if you skip down to verse 22 of chapter 4, it says of his sermon at Nazareth, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, is this not Joseph's son? So preaching in his own place, he got this level of acclaim and astonishment. Is this the Joseph that we knew? Or the Jesus that we knew? The Jesus that came up through Kids Club? And here he is now preaching like this? That's remarkable. And then by the end of his sermon, which we see as the text goes on in verse 29, it says this: they got up, drove him out of town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. What, pray tell, did Jesus say that so changed their opinion of him? How could a people be so changeable in so short a length of time? The answer is found in the development of thought within the person presenting the material, Jesus. And it's a story that goes like this. Verse 16, he came to Nazareth. From history and biblical archaeology, we know a little bit about Nazareth and its place in Galilee. Now you'll remember that just prior to this, Jesus had been in the wilderness of Judea with John the Baptist. And John the Baptist had been preaching this radical message. When the people came to him, he said, oh yeah, you're like a basket full of snakes. That's who you are. And this John was mentor to Jesus. Jesus had been baptized. Jesus had spent time in the wilderness. And now Jesus returns to his home community of Galilee, in particular to Nazareth, which was a little backwater town that was quirky, to say. It's like Crockett. Raise your hand if you've been to Crockett. I apologize if you're from Crockett. The centerpiece of Crockett is a biker bar with a stuffed polar bear in it. It's like that. Nazareth was like that. It was removed. It was in the hill country. No one really spent much time there. But also it was incredibly insular. It was very conservative, very closed off, very guarded, very buttoned down. That was Jesus' upbringing in an environment like that. And so he came to Nazareth, he came to there, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, it says, he stood up on the Sabbath day to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it's written. Here it is. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, verse 18, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And that brings us to verse 22, where all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" So up to this point in the sermon, there's no problem. We see Jesus operating within the custom and convention of his day. Jesus would not be a wilderness preacher like John on the periphery. He would be within the religious mainstream. He attended synagogue, and the custom was for him to go and he read from the scroll of Isaiah, and he said, "This is fulfilled today in your hearing." In other words, I am the fulfillment of this. This is why I've come. To preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. And they said, "Great. Right on. We're down with it." They got behind him. They were all about it. And then they said, "Isn't this Joseph's son? Don't we remember him?" And then Jesus, verse 23, said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we've heard that you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian.' When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up and drove him out of town and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff." What's happening is Jesus, the brand new preacher, is confronting the establishment. He's hitting them head on in the same way that the prophetic prince in the desert, John the Baptist, had been preaching. I said last week, Jesus was influenced by John. Here we see it. Jesus' first sermon in Nazareth is not a friendly, let's all get along and let's go together and move and do something big. It's a head-on collision with their bias, their prejudice, and their stereotypes. See, they were fine that Jesus would bring recovery of sight to their blind, that he would preach good news to their poor. But Jesus uses these two Older Testament examples And he said, there were a lot of widows suffering, but Elijah was sent to the farthest part outside of Israel. There were all kinds of lepers that were suffering, but the one who was healed was Naaman, also a foreigner. What Jesus is saying here in a nutshell is that my message is going to be a message of inclusion. It's going to be a message for the entire world, and what Nazareth wanted was a message for us. I don't think it's at all wrong to say that Jesus, in that moment, learned something about organized religion. Like a mighty tortoise moves the church of God. Brethren, we are treading where we've always trod. We like things the way that we like them. We want things the way that we want them. And what we want is a church that's full service for us. Take care of our needs. And Nazareth was no different than any church in our contemporary society. Jesus was learning. This is on-the-job training for him. It's saying something about what it meant to operate within the structure of the organization. And Jesus is figuring it out. They drove him out of town to throw him off the cliff. That's what they thought of his message of radical inclusion. That's what we think about your gospel being for the Gentiles as well as for the Jews. They weren't about that. They were all about Jesus being their Messiah, but not the Messiah of those folks over there, whoever they are. You see the principle that emerges out of this ancient text about the organization to which we belong? I think as well that we learned something about Jesus here also. Because the trajectory of his ministry and the tactics which he employed took a turn from this point in the narrative. And I think it's not blasphemous to say that Jesus learned something from this experience, and I like to think it's something like what I learned in that first sermon 30 years ago. If you've ever heard a preacher's first sermon, I apologize to you. It's not easy. Because a brand new preacher has a head full of ideas from a semester in Bible school and wants to tell you all of them.
Whoa.
This is the long and short, let me tell you. And so I probably, in that sermon on the prodigal son, covered every possible topic, and it was radical and it was confrontational. And what I learned, like what a lot of other preachers learned, like what Jesus himself learned, is what it means to be a radical revolutionary with the rough edges knocked off. Because that's what 30 years of ministry has done for me. It has made me more compassionate and understanding of the human situation. has made me more realistic in my appraisal of my own gifts, my own strengths, my own abilities. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the line it did. And this preacher came to discover that people didn't come on Sunday to hear him. They came to worship God. And it's things like that that only time can teach you, and only experiences like this can work out of you. Earlier in ministry, I would have seen this only one way. I would have seen this only as the narrow-minded, bigoted people that Jesus was called to preach to in Nazareth. But as I've matured in ministry, I think it's as much about him. And I think we'll see that moving forward in Luke's gospel, the way in which Jesus operates, maybe still within the confines of convention, more so than John the Baptist. But we see Jesus preaching on a lake. We see Jesus teaching as he walked along the road. We see Jesus expanding outside of the confines of the faith community. We see Jesus really taking it to the streets. And that is an important lesson for us to learn. So we come up against both sides of this. We come up against our own closed-mindedness as members of a congregation. We have our minds made up. And let's be honest and say that the majority of people on Sunday morning come to be reinforced with what they already believe and have become convinced of. People don't come with an open mind and an open spirit to learn and to be challenged and to grow. We know what we know. We know what we believe, and just tell us those same things and make us comfortable. Jesus wouldn't do it, and no preacher worth his salt or her salt would do it either. The gospel that we've come to proclaim is one that really is revolutionary. But it's revolutionary in a way that can be diplomatic. We see Jesus, rather than plain talking, confrontational, talking in parables. Almost as if he's speaking in code. Couching a spiritual message in a tale or a riddle. We see Jesus becoming increasingly unconventional in his ministry methods, and the same applies to those of us who follow him. I made a deal with the lovely Catherine in terms of this Luke series. She's to let me know if it gets boring for her. Because if it's getting boring for her, it's getting boring for the rest of them as well. And so if it's getting boring for you, let Catherine know. She'll let me know. And we'll move on from Luke into something else. But I'm entirely excited by the gospel. By the evolution of the gospel. By the Jesus and the evolution of Jesus that we meet in the gospel. I think it's beyond remarkable, and I am incredibly excited. So let me take a moment, and my friends, would you join with me as we pray? God, we thank you for the reality of change in the human spiritual condition. And we thank you that in that regard, Jesus is a model and a mentor to us. We thank you for the ways in which we grow and change as people over the course of our lifetime. As we think back 30 years or even just 30 days, sometimes 30 minutes, to realize how much we are in flux and we're changing and we're growing and evolving in exciting ways. God, rather than resisting that under the guise of theological dogma or whatever, help us to embrace an ever-expanding sense of spirituality and Christianity that refuses to be content with easy answers. So give us courage, intellectual, emotional, spiritual courage to be real disciples